welcome back, I hope, for the second vlog in a series about the Virginian's return to Normandy 2019. If you missed the first one, it's a little bit of a discussion about what the mission is, routing, how we're supposed to get there. And as I promised on the second vlog, I would like to discuss who the Virginian is, how she came to be, and how she got to where she is today. And so the Virginian, as I mentioned, is a World War II era vintage Douglas DC-3 C-47. And she was actually born September 23rd, 1943. So, it's half a year or so before the Normandy Invasion. That was actually her first combat mission. She flew across the channel in about March of 44, partook in many practice for Normandy, and was based there at Barkston Heath. So how did she come to be? It's hard to talk about a history of any particular DC-3 or C-47 without at least retracing at least what I believe to be what created her and how she came to be. And when I look back in the history of aviation, of course, everybody thinks Orville will be right. It was December 17th of 1903. First flight. Well, that was all pretty good. Goes down to history. But the one event I think that really happened, that really put aviation in the public eye, was Lindbergh. He flew nonstop New York to Paris in a single-engine piston-powered airplane. And that was 1927, May 20th and 21st of 1927. Here we are, let me do the math right, what are we, 92 years later? And there's not a single-engine airplane out there that even today I would want to make that trip in. Certainly not a piston-powered one. I don't even know of one that could physically do it. We take what there's, the video before I showed the route we're taking, and that route has a nickname. It's called the Blue Spruce route. They flew it in World War II, ferrying airplanes over from the United States over to England. And that's the route we're going to be following, a much more friendly general aviation route. It's hard to imagine flying direct New York to Paris in just about anything GA involved, unless you're in a Gulfstream. But for most of us guys, it's little single-engine Cessnas and whatnot, Pipers. And flying across the Atlantic nonstop, I can't even envision it here. 92 years later, still can't figure out how you do it. But anyway, so when Lindbergh did it, he became an overnight hero, overnight celebrity. And when he came back to New York, I think his ticker tape parade in New York City was one of the largest ever still in the history of New York. So it really brought, I think, aviation to the public mind. I think, non-aviating people started wondering if maybe there wasn't a future for them. Maybe they could someday fly an airplane to someplace, because prior to that event, and even during this time, it was pretty rare to be able to hop in an airplane and fly anywhere. I mean, they had passenger ships were like the little Ford tri-motor, did a little over 100 miles an hour. It wasn't much better than traveling in a train, significantly riskier, but didn't offer much over traveling by train of all things. So, but I think it really spurred the thought of possibly traveling by air. And so one of the first companies that really put that thought down to paper, design, and construction was Boeing. Boeing was a going entity back then. And they built what many consider to be the first modern airliner. It was a Boeing Model 247. Twin engine, all metal, all aluminum, no wooden fabric. So fast, it was, topped out around 200 miles an hour. Originally, it was supposed to carry, I think, about a dozen, but I think typically most of them carried like 9 to 10 passengers. And in those days, 9 to 10 passengers wasn't going to pay for it. And almost all of them carried, any commercial airplane operation back then had to carry mail to help them pay their way. And as a little side note, 2018, we just finished up, was the 100th anniversary of U.S. airmail. So they actually started flying that, so that would have been 1918. In some pretty rickety looking biplanes. So a lot of great stories about those first mail routes. Encourage you to look them up. If you're into aviation history, that's one of the milestones of aviation history is U.S. mail operations. So Boeing built the 247. It first flew on February 8th of 1933. And almost, I think it must have been just about parallel to that. I mean, Boeing was maybe the first, but they weren't the only ones that were thinking there was a future in this airline business. And TWA was in existence, flying some pretty rickety airplanes. And they were asking for somebody to build something. They were not in the construction business like Boeing. So they sent out, there was a gentleman there named Jack Fry. And Jack Fry, I think, was VP of operations for TWA at the time. And he wrote a letter, it's now fairly famous. He wrote a letter to several aviation engineering outfits and construction people, asking for somebody to build him an airplane. One of the people that received that letter was Donald Douglas. He was a young guy, his early 30s. He pretty much just started his own airplane design business. And he gets this letter. And so it's not so much the dates, but the timing. So this letter was written August 2nd, 1932. So even if it went by airmail from New York to Santa Monica, where Douglas was, I don't know, 10 days maybe? I don't know how long it would have taken. That's what went by air. So Donald probably received this thing in mid-August. Right away, he saw the potential here. He was probably thinking along those same lines. And here he gets a letter somebody asked him to build something. So he assigns an engineer by the name of Arthur Raymond. He says, "Here, Arthur, here's this letter. See what you can do. We need to get into this ball game, and so we need to make a proposal here to Jack Fry with TWA." And so, show you how things happened back then. Today is full of lawyers and everything else, but back then, so Arthur 1 week later takes off on a train. They didn't fly because they needed the time the train was going to take, but also flying back then was somewhat of a risky proposition. So they take a train. So it's Arthur Raymond and another engineer named Harry Wetzel. And they take a train all the way to New York. So I don't know how long that took in those days. I don't know if it was a week, 10 days, whatever it was, but they needed that time to finish their proposal. And when they walk into the TWA offices, who was there besides Jack Fry? Charles Lindbergh. And, "Hey, Chuck, what are you doing here?" "Well, they've hired me to evaluate your proposal." And so that letter that went out to him has some specific performance criteria and design criteria. One of the things on there was that you're going to build a tri-motor airplane. TWA wanted to make darn sure that got a plane load of people. If we lose an engine, we're not going down. This airplane's got to fly if it loses an engine. Well, the design concept that Art Raymond dreamed up was a twin-engine airplane. And that's sure enough, that first thing they spotted. And so Jack Fry is doubting, how the heck can this work? We told you in this letter, we need to be able to fly at 8,000 feet and lose an engine. And so Arthur and Harry were about trying to figure out how to convince Jack Fry that this is going to work. Lindbergh chimes in. He goes, "Tell you what, guys, if it works and you build it, we'll buy it. If it doesn't, we're going to go someplace else." So you talk about pressure. So they leave, head back to Santa Monica, get back, talk to Donald, and so starts the design of what became the Douglas DC-1. Douglas's TC stands for Douglas Commercial. Douglas DC-1, there was only one made. It was proof of concept, prototype. It flew and eventually was delivered to TWA. They flew it for a while. But the interesting thing is that so this letter went out in August of 32. They had that meeting back in New York. I don't even know when that was exactly. I'm going to guess September. And that DC-1 flew July 1st, 1933. So not even a year later, they design and build and fly the DC-1. I mean, I don't know how you do that. Today, can you imagine Boeing thinking about building an airplane, then designing, building it, flying it in the same year? That just can't happen. So one of the interesting little side notes when they were building the DC-1, there was competition for what the engine was going to be. There were two primary engine manufacturers back in those days, Curtiss-Wright and Pratt & Whitney. And Donald Douglas had a plant in Santa Monica. And those two engine manufacturers had offices inside the Douglas plant. And I say offices, they were bordered by sheets hanging from the ceiling. So temporary offices at best. And I can only imagine how life was back then. The competition to be the engine, any of the suppliers to this new airplane was pretty intense. But here you got these two primary components, the engines, with guys separated by sheets trying to figure out how to make this all happen. As it turned out, they ended up picking a Wright engine, and I think Wright's probably powered the DC-1. The DC-1 evolved. They only built one of them. The next airplane along the line was called the DC-2. DC-2 was a larger version than the DC-1, carried 14 people, way outperformed the Boeing 247, became the airplane of choice for anybody in the airline business. Everybody was ordering it, including United. TWA certainly got them. American, Eastern, Western. They all started buying in, and these started delivering DC-2s. And everybody's pretty happy. Donald's happy. The plant's operating capacity. He bet the farm. This is right after the Depression, remember. And he bet the whole farm, his whole company on this project, and hit a home run. And pretty amazing you think about it back then, how the pressure must have been and how fast things happen. You don't have all the paperwork. You don't have a room full of attorneys. Things can happen. Everybody was pretty happy, same except one guy. He was happy, but he had envisioned something a little bit better, and that was C.R. Smith. C.R. Smith was the CEO of American Airlines, and he had envisioned a plane to fly cross country, basically, all the way from East Coast to West Coast. And he wanted to be able to do it. You can't do it nonstop, but he wanted to be able to take flights all the way from East Coast to the West Coast, and he envisioned his passengers sleeping on board. So you'd get on an airplane one day, start traveling, they had to make a couple fuel stops, but you sleep in the airplane, you get up the next day, and you're on the West Coast. And so a little larger version than the DC-2. Another thing, too, I don't think the DC-2 could go nonstop from New York to Chicago, which was a big thing. So that was one of C.R. Smith's wishes, was a plane that could take him better from New York to Chicago, and also one they can go all the way across country with. And so, at any rate, so he actually got a hold of Arthur Raymond, and the two of those guys put their heads together, and they actually penciled out a concept of what this airplane could be. I don't know how much time they spent on it, or if there was any engineering involved, I'm not sure, but they both went to Donald Douglas and pitched this. And Donald goes, "You guys are nuts. Look at my plan out here. It's operating capacity. We got orders we're trying to fill. I haven't got time, and I'm not motivated. Why would I design a brand new airplane today when we're knocking it out of the park right now?" And so it wasn't the response that C.R. Smith wanted. And as the story goes, there's a fairly famous phone call that happened between C.R. Smith and Donald Douglas. This phone call went on for several hours. And the story that's told is that phone call cost $300. Long distance phone calls were not cheap back in those days. And $300 was the cost of a new car. And so, but what sealed the deal was C.R. Smith says, "Tell you what, here's a purchase order for 20 of them." And so that's what that purchase order for 20 was for 8 what they called Douglas sleeper transports, DSTs. That was the version that was going to have these sleeping berths in them. I think they're only going to carry like 11 or 12 passengers because they had to have room for sleeping bunks. And the rest of the other 12 were going to be for what is the DC-3. And so two things are key to the development of the DC-3. That Jack Fry letter, which Donald Douglas called it the birth certificate for the entire DC line of aircraft. So certainly a DC-3. The other was that phone call, what C.R. Smith wanted. Without those two letters, who knows what history would have been, but with the DC-3 had been built, who knows. Apparently, like I said, but the timing again, here's another part that gets me. So it was 1934. It was they had built about 100 DC-2s when Smith and Raymond got together and conceived what was going to be the DC-3. May 10th of 1935, a report, I don't know what they mean by a report, I don't know if there's any engineering in it or what, but there was a report created that was going to spell out what was going to become the DC-3. So May 10th, 35, the DC-3 first flight was December 17th. That's the Orville Wilbur anniversary. 32 years later, 1935. December 17th, 1935, the first flight of the DC-3. So it was a pretty good concept in May 10th, and they designed, built, flew it by December 17th. Once again, I mean, how things happened back in those days, highly motivated, pretty amazing. So they built 609 DC-3s before the U.S. military took over the production. And I say took over, I mean, Douglas had already conceived of what, and the military already saw this airplane, saw this is going to be a big help to us, and Douglas looked at it and goes, yes, let me make some improvements to it. What became the C-47, still a DC-3 with some slight changes in it. They had a different floor in it. If you know what I'm talking about, they had those big barn door cargo doors on them. There's pictures of actually driving a Jeep into the airplane. A little bit beefier gear, and see what else was there about it. That's mostly it. The floor, the doors, and the gear. And that's what became the C-47. And there's several iterations of this. The C-47 was by far the most numerous, but the difference between the different models made during the war is actually pretty slight. Some were better at carrying cargo, some were better at carrying troops, parachutists. Some were built just to carry VIPs around. And most of those 609 DC-3s that were built before the war were drafted into the war, so even they were a part of it. So as I mentioned before, the Virginia Ann was born on September 23rd, 1943. She was assigned the serial number 43-30647. So that serial number is generated by the government when they place either the purchase order or they allocate the funds to buy it. It's not necessarily, it's not the manufacturing order. It's the order in which they were ordered. And in those days, that'll happen pretty fast. So the number you see on the Virginia Ann and all C-47s, their serial number omits the 4. It's just redundant. They all had 4s, so leave it off. So the number on the side of the Virginia Ann is 330647. And so if you ever want to know, looking at another C-47 that's been painted as she was, just put a 4 in front of the first number, and you'll know when she was likely manufactured and delivered. It all happened pretty fast back in those days. So like the case of Virginia Ann, it was put a 4 in front of it, so 43. So she's manufactured and her delivery actually were ordered in 43. But back then it all happened pretty much right on top of each other. A little piece of trivia there. So she gets manufactured. I got my little cheat notes here. Make sure I cover what I want to cover. So the planned invasion of Europe the planning had been going on for almost 2 years. It probably started in 42. And somewhere online it got named Operation Overlord. You probably heard that. Overlord was the overall mission of the invasion and conquer of Europe, free Europe. And under Operation Overlord, there were several other operations. One was Operation Neptune. Neptune was the goal was to establish a foothold on the European continent in France. It included the beach invasion. It included the airborne invasion. And the goal there was just to establish a foothold to get started. And so obviously the Virginia Ann was part of Operation Neptune. And there were several missions under Operation Neptune. There were 2 significant airborne ones. Was Mission Albany. Mission Albany was 101st Airborne, and Mission Boston, which was 82nd Airborne. And the Virginia Ann was a part of Mission Boston. And when she arrived in Europe, she was assigned to a squadron, the 59th Squadron. And a little piece of trivia, squadrons have unique identification number, usually a letter and a number. And you'll see them painted up near the cockpit, big, 4 or 5 foot tall numbers. In the case of Virginia Ann, it's X5. And that X5 designates the squadron number. So X5 is the 59th Squadron. And she was assigned the 59th Squadron, which was a part of the 61st Troop Carrier Group. Now, a group typically had 4 squadrons. And so the other squadrons in the 61st were the 14th, 15th, 53rd, and the 59th. So there are 4 squadrons. Each squadron is 15 to 18 airplanes. For the D-Day invasion, it was 18. So there were 72 ships that made up the 61st Troop Carrier Group. And so a little bit of trivia. Oh, here's another one for you. So the original D-Day invasion date was supposed to be June 5th. It happened June 6th, but it was supposed to be June 5th. Eisenhower granted a weather postponement. I mean, crappy weather. So he put it off from the 5th to the 6th. So they're all, originally, of course, none of the troops, nobody knew what was going to happen until the last minute. But the original plan was to take off on the 4th, on the 5th. On the 4th, they all received orders to paint the airplanes. You can imagine the heyday, how that must have happened. Here, Johnny, here's a bucket of paint and a brush. Go paint that airplane. What am I supposed to do? Well, they learned a lesson when they invaded Italy. The 61st was involved there, and it was part of a larger group, the 52nd Wing, Troop Carrier Wing. And when they invaded Italy, I can't remember how many airplanes were involved. There's probably 4 or 5 groups. And they lost somewhere 20 to 25 airplanes, troop carriers, full of parachutists, to friendly fire. Pretty sad, awful lesson to have to learn. But in order to prevent that, they came up with this plan to paint the airplanes on the 4th of June. And that's where we call them invasion stripes. That's those black and white stripes you see on many airplanes. The troop carriers all had them. The fighter aircraft all had them. Most all the airplanes were painted overnight, basically in a day, with those black and white stripes. The only ones that weren't were like the higher elevation, higher altitude bombers. So here you go, Johnny, paint the airplane. You had a couple of buckets of paint, black and white, and this paintbrush was about, about yay big. I've seen pictures of it. And here he is out there just slopping it on. The Virginia Ann has those invasion stripes, as she did back then, only they don't look quite the same. And when we painted the Virginia Ann, we masked it, we painted it. It looks really nice. When we introduce you to the Virginia Ann, you'll see what I'm talking about. But it didn't look like that on June 6th, 1944. There's been a few people that have restored the airplanes and tried to be period correct. There's a pretty famous one that just got restored here, I think 2 winters ago. There's a company in Wisconsin at Oshkosh, Basler, and part of their business is converting these old DC-3 C-47s to a turbine-powered airplane. They call them a BT-67. It's a whole new airplane, whole new type certificate, but they start with an old DC-3 C-47 and convert them to a turbine. Well, they have a boneyard of old airplanes to work with. One of the airplanes in that boneyard, somebody discovered, I don't know if it was Basler or somebody else looked it up. I'm not sure how they found it, but they knew that Basler had it. And as it turns out, it's a plane today. It's called, had the name on it, ours is Virginia Ann. This one was That's All Brother. Now, That's All Brother, turns out, was the lead ship D-Day. So it was a lead parachute infantry regiment carrier on D-Day. Now, they had a few went ahead of time. They were called Pathfinders. They helped set up the drop zones. But That's All Brother was the very first troop carrier to cross. And there they found it in Basler. They saved it from being converted. Spent 2-3 years restoring it. And it looks beautiful. And she's coming with us. She'll be making this trip over to Normandy for 2019 also. So hopefully we'll be able to show you some pictures of that one too. Or you can probably Google it up. I bet they have quite a few pictures that were out there. So the 61st Troop Carrier Group that Virginia was a part of was commanded by Colonel Willis Mitchell. And based at Barkston Heath. And for reasons I wish I knew, but I don't know, it could be because the Virginia Ann, another name for her back then was just 647, the last numbers of her serial number. He chose 647 to lead the 61st Troop Carrier Group that night. I wish I knew why, but I don't. So he flew the Virginia Ann on D-Day, led these 72 ships. They were carrying the 82nd Airborne. They carried the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and that's who jumped out of that airplane that night. There were 72 ships, there's probably 12 to 1,300 parachuters. I think there was what they call them there's the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment, but they had 2 battalions of them, I guess is the term I'm looking for. And unfortunately, the 507th, you look back at the history there, but the 507th, I think, had the worst casualty rate of all the parachute infantry regiments. Not a good record to have. One of the gentlemen that jumped out of the Virginian was a Colonel George Millett, and Colonel Millett was the commander of the 507th Regiment, and he was captured on D-Day +2. So he spent the remainder of the war as a POW. And 2 of the other gentlemen on board, 2 of the other soldiers didn't survive D-Day. But that was, unfortunately, a typical story for many of the 507th. So anyway, so the Virginian went on after D-Day to partake in Operation Market Garden and Operation Varsity, all parachute infantry regiment drops, tow gliders. Had a pretty interesting war history. Hopefully get a chance to get into that a little bit more. But that brings her up through the war. She was one of the ships that made it home after the war, and she was converted soon after to a full-on airliner. Today from the outside she looks the part, but she no longer has those big cargo doors or the cargo floor. She has an air stair door. That's pretty nice interior. A long ways from being what she was on June 6th. We went so far as to paint her so she looks the part, looks like she did on that day, but she's a long ways from being a 1944 parachute dropper. But we're pretty proud of her. A great history she has, and glad to share it with you. After the war, like I said, she was converted. She did a stint with Piedmont Airlines for a while, but and for a while she was owned by her registration number is November 62 Charlie, and the Charlie was a gentleman's name. I can't remember his name, Charlie Cody maybe, but anyway, he was a booster for the University of Georgia. At one point in time, I saw a picture of the Virginian with a bulldog on the tail. So spent some time with him. For the most part, she was a corporate plane most of her life. Fairly low times as DC-3s go. She's adolescent at 17,000 hours. I know a few that are way over 50. And there's one flying around every time she flies. She sets a new record. She's around 80-some thousand hours. So anyway, we're lucky to have her on the... so that's what I'd like to cover in this vlog. I'm trying to keep them not getting too long and too boring. The next time around, I'll just kind of discuss how we got her and how she found her way to California, and what we're trying to do to get her ready to go on this journey, this once-in-a-lifetime journey. This is likely the last time you'll see this many DC-3 C-47s in one place at the same time. It probably hasn't happened since the war. They're hoping for, the 15 to 17 of us. I think there's another dozen or more in Europe, and they're hoping to have formation flights with close to 30 airplanes in the air. Should be pretty spectacular. So I'm just trying to tease you a little bit, trying to convince you maybe this is a fun thing to follow along. This part's kind of boring, but like I say, we'll get to the point where we get the cameras rolling, get the plane flying, and so the next vlog, I just want to cover how we acquired her and how she got to where she is today, and then so it'll be maybe the next vlog after that. We'll introduce you to her when we get back to where she's at. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy this, and stick around and look for the next one.